No woman lasted a night with him, they whispered. She fell asleep in the Mafia boss's arms. Who walks into the private chambers of the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, wearing an old college hoodie, and falls asleep in under 3 minutes? Marisol Vance did exactly that, and by morning, the man everyone called untouchable was watching her sleep, instead of deciding how to make her disappear. Before we dive in, kindly smash that subscribe button, like and comment which city you're watching from, because what happened in that room by sunrise is about to change everything you thought you knew about the man they called untouchable. Rain hammered the windows of a diner on the edge of downtown Newark, blurring the neon signs into streaks of bleeding red. Marisol Vance sat in the corner booth, a cup of lukewarm coffee wrapped between her fingers. She was a plus-size woman who'd long ago made peace with taking up space in a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves into something smaller and more palatable. Broad-shouldered, soft through the middle, dark circles carved beneath tired brown eyes, the undeniable badge of a woman working 2 jobs to bury debt that refused to stay buried. Her father had died 18 months earlier, the cancer treatment eating through every dollar of savings the family had ever managed to scrape together, before finally taking him anyway. The hospital bills hadn't stopped arriving just because he had. They'd simply changed addressee, landing squarely on Marisol's kitchen table month after month, each one a fresh reminder that grief didn't pause for financial reality, and neither did the collectors calling 3 times a day demanding payments she couldn't make on wages that barely covered rent. Across from her sat a man in a suit that looked obscenely out of place amid the smell of stale grease and burnt coffee. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Vance." His voice carried the smooth, practiced condescension of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The man I represent usually requires a different demographic. The women sent to his estate are typically models, socialites, women who understand the art of looking beautiful while terrified. And they all disappear, don't they?" Marisol took a slow sip of her coffee, unbothered. The man's jaw tightened. "They leave. What happens after that is bound by an agreement that's heavily enforced. Mr. Castellano is a private man with particular tastes. He's also extraordinarily generous. 1 night, sundown to sunrise. Remain in his chambers. Don't attempt to flee the estate, and $1 million will be wired to your account by 7 a.m. Marisol laughed, a deep sound that made the man flinch. "I owe $600,000 to collectors who threatened my kneecaps last week. You think I'm scared of some rich man playing recluse in a mansion somewhere? He doesn't play, Miss Vance." The man leaned forward, voice dropping. "The rumors about Damien Castellano aren't rumors. Every woman who's ever gone into that room has come out broken, if she comes out at all. No woman has lasted a full night with him in a decade. They panic, they run, and when they run, things get considerably worse for everyone involved." Marisol looked at the contract sliding across the table, thick, printed on heavy paper that felt more official than anything she'd signed in years. She didn't see a death sentence. She saw the collector's threats finally shrinking down to nothing. She saw a life where she wasn't choosing between rent and her mother's blood pressure medication. She grabbed the pen and signed her name with a flourish. "Have a car pick me up at 6. Marisol stood and gathered her coat. "And tell your boss I don't do silk. I sleep in flannel." She walked out into the rain without waiting for a response, leaving the fixer sitting alone in the booth, staring at the signed contract as though he still couldn't quite believe what he'd just watched happen. Every other woman he'd approached with this particular offer had needed hours of persuasion, tears, sometimes a second meeting entirely. Marisol Vance had needed exactly 11 minutes and 1 cup of terrible coffee. The drive to the Castellano estate took nearly 3 hours, deep into isolated countryside where the roads narrowed and the trees pressed close against the windows of the blacked-out sedan. By the time iron gates finally loomed into view, the sun had dropped below the horizon, plunging the world into deep, bruised twilight. The mansion rose like something out of a Gothic nightmare, dark stone and towering windows, perched at the edge of a cliff overlooking black water that churned somewhere far below. A severe-looking housekeeper named Renata Voss greeted Marisol at the heavy front doors, her eyes sweeping over Marisol's full figure, with barely concealed disapproval. "You're not what we typically expect," Renata's voice echoed off marble floors. "I get that a lot," Marisol muttered, dragging her duffel bag over the threshold. "Leave your belongings here. You'll be bathed, dressed, and presented to the master's chambers." Renata's tone stayed clipped, formal. "You should understand, Mr. Castellano tolerates no disruption. If you feel the urge to scream, I'd suggest swallowing it. These walls are thick, and nobody will come running." Marisol was led up a sweeping staircase past centuries of pale, hollow-eyed portraits, subjected to a rigid bathing process by silent staff, who then attempted to dress her in something thin and crimson. She refused instantly, reaching into her duffel bag instead for worn flannel pajama pants and an oversized gray hoodie she'd owned since college. Renata looked as though she might faint from outrage. "You cannot present yourself to Mr. Castellano dressed like that. If he's after my throat, he can find it just fine in a hoodie," Marisol reasoned, pulling the fabric over her head. "Now, where's this bedroom? It's past 9, and I've been up since 4 this morning." Trembling with indignation, Renata escorted her to the highest floor of the West Wing, unlocked a massive iron-studded door, pushed Marisol inside, and slammed it shut behind her. The deadbolt clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the dark room. She was locked in. The night had officially begun. The chamber was enormous, bathed in the pale silver light of a full moon spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. The air carried a faint chill, sharp with something like ozone and old velvet. Heavy drapes framed the glass, and towering bookshelves lined every wall not occupied by windows. At the center of the room sat a massive 4-poster bed, draped in dark furs and immaculate white linen. Marisol stood in her flannel pajamas, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere in the corner, the only sound breaking the suffocating quiet. She let out a long, heavy sigh. Her feet ached. Her lower back throbbed from 3 hours in a cramped sedan, and the bone-deep exhaustion of 5 years working herself into the ground finally settled onto her shoulders, like something physical. She looked at the bed. It looked like a cloud made of expensive down feathers. "Well," Marisol muttered to the empty room, "at $1 million a night, I'm at least getting a decent nap out of this." Without hesitation, she marched to the enormous bed, climbed onto the thick mattress, and burrowed beneath the heavy furs. The sheets felt impossibly soft, carrying the faint scent of cedar and cold winter air. She let out a groan of pure relief as the mattress cradled her heavy frame, relieving every ache in her joints at once. She hugged a massive pillow to her chest, closed her eyes, and within 3 minutes, she was completely dead to the world. An hour later, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The shadows in the far corner seemed to peel away from the walls, coalescing into a tall, imposing figure. Damien Castellano had arrived. He was a man built from lethal precision, sharp aristocratic features carved like something out of marble, dark hair brushing the collar of a tailored black suit. His eyes carried the particular stillness of a man who'd spent decades commanding fear without needing to raise his voice. He expected, as he always expected, to find a fragile creature cowering somewhere in the shadows, offering compliance in exchange for survival. Instead, he heard a sound that shattered whatever composure he'd walked in wearing: snoring. Damien froze, dark eyes narrowing in real confusion. He crossed the room silently, footsteps making no sound against the Persian rug, until he stood at the edge of the bed. There, buried beneath his own family's furs, lay a woman, not fragile, not trembling, substantial, soft, entirely unbothered by anything happening around her. She wore a gray hoodie that had seen better decades, one thick leg thrown carelessly over his silk duvet, a small trail of drool escaping the corner of her parted lips. Damien stood there a full 10 minutes, paralyzed by something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Confusion, mostly. something else underneath it he didn't yet have a name for. He reached out a hand, intending to wake her, to finally deliver whatever fear she owed him for daring to sleep so completely in his presence. But as his fingers hovered an inch from her shoulder, he stopped. Her heartbeat reached him first, steady, slow, rhythmic in a way that had nothing to do with fear at all. No spike of adrenaline, no sour edge of terror ruining the calm rhythm of her pulse. She smelled like cheap soap and exhaustion and something close to peace, a scent he hadn't encountered in this room in longer than he wanted to admit. He leaned closer, his own breath catching at the warmth radiating off her skin. Marisol stirred. She didn't open her eyes, but her nose scrunched, and she swatted blindly at the air like shooing away a fly. "Turn the AC down," she mumbled. "I'm sleeping." With a heavy shift of weight, she rolled over completely, turning her back to the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, and yanked the fur blanket entirely over her own shoulders, leaving Damien standing in the sudden cold. The Mafia boss blinked. For a long moment he simply stood there, cold air settling over his skin where the blanket had been pulled away, processing the fact that he'd just been dismissed, out loud, by a mortal woman who hadn't even opened her eyes to acknowledge his presence. In 300 years of feeding, of hunting, of building a reputation that made entire families cross themselves at the mention of his name, nothing had ever prepared him for this particular kind of insult. The sheer audacity of it looped right back around into something almost funny. A rusty, unfamiliar chuckle escaped his throat, a sound he was fairly certain hadn't left his body since sometime in the previous century. He glanced at the woman burrowed beneath his own furs, at the steady, unbothered rise and fall of her breathing, and found himself entirely unable to summon the fury the moment should have demanded. Instead of reaching for her throat, Damien crossed to the heavy leather armchair positioned near the window and sat down in the darkness. He told himself he was simply deciding how to handle the situation, weighing his options, considering the appropriate response to a woman who'd walked into his private chambers and treated the most feared bed on the eastern seaboard like a hotel room she was paying good money to enjoy. He told himself that for almost an hour before finally admitting the truth. He wasn't deciding anything at all. He was simply watching her sleep quietly, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the maddening, restless noise that lived permanently behind his ribs had gone completely, blessedly quiet. By the time gray dawn light began creeping through the tall windows, Damien had not moved from the armchair once. He'd spent centuries mastering stillness, but this particular stillness felt different, unfamiliar, in a way that unsettled him more than any threat ever had. He replayed the last several hours over and over, trying to understand exactly what had shifted, cataloging the sensation the same way he cataloged everything else that mattered, methodically, patiently, refusing to accept a conclusion until every piece fit together completely. The silence in his own chest was the piece that refused to make sense. 300 years of restless, gnawing tension, and somehow one exhausted woman in flannel pajamas had unraveled it in a single night without even trying. He'd fed on fear for 300 years. Not by choice exactly, but because fear was what every woman sent to this room had ever offered him. Terror spiking their heartbeats into frantic, jagged rhythms that made his hunger claw and twist with a violence he'd learned to barely contain. Every visit reinforced the same brutal cycle. Fear fed the hunger demanded more fear, and somewhere along the way, decades ago now, sleep had become a stranger to him entirely, replaced by a permanent, gnawing hypervigilance that never once allowed his mind to settle. He'd told himself it was simply the nature of what he was. He'd never once considered it might be something else, something worse, something a decade of terrified women had only ever made deeper. Marisol Vance had walked into this room and slept within 3 minutes. Her pulse had stayed at a steady 60 beats the entire night, rhythmic, unbothered, the calmest heartbeat he'd encountered in longer than he could accurately calculate. No spike, no sour cortisol scent ruining the clean warmth of her blood. Just peace, radiating off a sleeping woman who had no idea what she'd just done to a man who hadn't experienced actual rest in over a decade. Damien watched the sun climb higher, watched golden light spill across the fur blankets, and the woman still buried beneath them, and understood, with a clarity that startled him, that something fundamental had shifted inside his chest, sometime during the last several hours. The restless noise that lived permanently behind his ribs, the constant hyper-vigilant hum that never once quieted, no matter how many decades passed, had gone entirely silent for the first time he could remember. Marisol stirred just after 7, stretching her thick arms with a loud yawn before sitting up. She jumped slightly, spotting the man sitting perfectly still in the armchair, his eyes now a warm amber, instead of the sharp crimson she vaguely remembered from somewhere in her half-asleep memory of the previous night. "Good morning, Miss Vance." His voice carried a dark, velvety quality that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine despite herself. "It seems you've survived the night." "Great." Marisol rubbed the sleep from her eyes, entirely unfazed. "Do you validate parking, or does the million get wired directly?" Damien's lips curved into something dangerous and fascinated at once. "The money is already yours, but I find myself unwilling to let you leave just yet. It appears we have a new contract to negotiate." Marisol reached for her cracked phone on the nightstand, opening her banking app with a breath she'd been holding without realizing it. The loading circle spun. Then numbers appeared. She stared at the balance, feeling something in her chest release for the first time in 5 years, the suffocating weight of debt lifting completely off her shoulders in a single instant. She looked back up at Damien, studying him properly now, the ancient predator who looked less like a monster and more like an exhausted executive who hadn't slept properly in a decade. "1 million was the agreed rate for me to stay until sunrise." Marisol's voice stayed steady. "The sun's up. The contract's concluded. Unless you're proposing something new." "I am." Damien stood with a fluid grace that seemed to defy physics entirely. "Over the past century, my kind has been succumbing to something we call the frenzy. It's brought on by consuming terror, by feeding on adrenaline and fear, in large enough doses that it poisons the mind, slowly, patiently, until nothing feels calm anymore. For decades, every woman sent to this room has reeked of it, hearts hammering like trapped animals, fear souring their blood, driving the hunger into something maddening." He paused, resting his pale hands against the carved footboard of the bed. "But you came into the private chambers of an apex predator, wearing a hoodie with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and you fell asleep. Your heart rate stayed calm the entire night." "I haven't slept in a decade, Marisol. Not once, not fully. I need someone whose presence quiets the noise instead of feeding it." Marisol raised an eyebrow. "You did a background check on a woman you planned to eat." "I'm thorough," Damien answered, a faint smirk playing at his mouth. "I want you to stay, live in this estate, sleep in my presence when the nights are worst. I have an estate library that hasn't been properly catalogued in 3 centuries. In exchange, 500,000 a week, tax-free, and my word that no harm comes to you under this roof." Marisol considered the offer with the same flat practicality she'd apply to any job posting, weighing the number against the life she could finally build, the charity she'd wanted to start in her father's memory, the freedom that came with never again choosing between rent and medication. 2 conditions. She held up 2 fingers. "First, I'm not a pet. I'm an employee. If I want donuts delivered or flannel pajamas every single night, you don't complain. Second, your staff treats me with respect." That housekeeper looked at me like something she scraped off her shoe. Damien's amber eyes flickered toward something darker, protective in a way that surprised even him. "Renata's insolence will be addressed. You have my word." Before Marisol could formally accept, the heavy doors of the chamber swung open without warning. A man strode in radiating icy fury, blonde hair slicked back, pale skin practically glowing with unnatural vitality. "Damien, what is the meaning of this?" Victor stopped short, cold blue eyes landing on Marisol still sitting in the bed, his lip curling into open disgust. "The sun's up and the mortal's still breathing." And what a repulsive choice they sent you this time. Has the king lost his appetite, or merely his standards? Damien didn't raise his voice, but the temperature in the room dropped sharply enough that Marisol felt it in her bones. Victor, you forget yourself. You're standing in my private sanctum uninvited. The council's waiting for a report, Victor snapped, stepping closer, ignoring the warning entirely. You haven't fed properly in weeks. If you won't dispose of the livestock, allow me. He lunged toward the bed with terrifying speed, fangs descending, eyes gone completely black. Marisol didn't even have time to scream. Damien moved faster, intercepting Victor mid-air with a thunderous crash that shook the entire room, slamming his cousin back against the ancient stone wall hard enough to crack the masonry. His hand wrapped tight around Victor's throat, lifting him fully off the floor. Let me make this abundantly clear. Damien's voice vibrated with a resonance that rattled the windows. Marisol is under my protection. She is the archivist of this estate. If you or anyone on that council so much as look at her wrong, I will tear your head from your shoulders myself. Victor thrashed, choking, managing a frantic nod against the crushing grip. Damien released him. Victor collapsed, coughing violently, scrambling toward the door before pausing at the threshold, fury replacing the fear in his expression as he straightened his ruined collar. This isn't finished. Victor's voice shook with barely restrained rage. The council will hear about this, about her, about what you've become since she walked into this house. He disappeared through the door without another word, leaving the sound of his furious footsteps echoing down the hallway long after he'd gone. Marisol let out a long, slow breath, staring at the fresh crack running through the stone wall where Victor had slammed against it moments earlier. She'd survived plenty of frightening things over the past 5 years, aggressive debt collectors, 3 job losses in the same year, watching her father fade slowly under fluorescent hospital lighting, but nothing had ever quite prepared her for watching a man get thrown into a wall hard enough to crack ancient masonry. Damien straightened the lapels of his suit, smoothing the fabric with the same precision he applied to everything, though something in his expression when he turned back to her carried a weight that hadn't been there a minute earlier. I apologize for the interruption. Shall I have Renata bring you breakfast? Marisol studied him a long moment, taking in the crimson still fading slowly from his eyes, the tension still coiled through his shoulders, even as he tried to settle back into something resembling composure. Yeah, she finally answered. I'll take a Denver omelet, extra cheese, and whatever passes for strong coffee around here. Something that might have been relief crossed his features, quickly smoothed into the same unreadable calm he wore like armor. He nodded once, moved toward the door, then paused, hand on the frame. That was Victor Castellano, my cousin. Next in line if the council ever decides I'm unfit to lead this family. And is he going to be a problem? Damien's jaw tightened, calculations settling behind his amber eyes. He's been trying to prove I'm unstable for months. My condition made that case easy for him. It's going to be far harder for him to argue that now. He left the room without further explanation, the heavy door clicking firmly shut behind him, and Marisol sat alone in the bed, staring at the cracked stone wall, wondering exactly what kind of arrangement she'd signed into, and whether the $1 million already sitting in her account was worth whatever came next. 3 weeks into her arrangement, Marisol Vance had become something the Castellano estate had never once accommodated before. Routine. She'd never once considered herself the kind of woman who adapted easily to Gothic mansions, or ancient predators, or staff who watched her every move with poorly concealed suspicion. But somewhere between the 2nd week and the 3rd, the estate had simply stopped feeling foreign. The halls had shapes she recognized now. The library had become the closest thing to a real home she'd had since her father died. 3 centuries of neglected history waiting patiently for someone who actually cared enough to organize it properly, instead of letting it rot beneath dust and time. She woke every morning around 9, well after Damien had retreated to whatever wing housed him during daylight hours, and spent her mornings in the subterranean library, a sprawling cavern of mahogany shelves and forgotten history that smelled like old paper and cold stone. Armed with archival gloves, acid-free sleeves, and a label maker she'd ordered through overnight shipping, she worked her way through 3 centuries of chaotic hoarding, one meticulously catalogued box at a time. Every evening, just after sunset, Damien joined her. At first he simply watched from the corner armchair, nursing a glass of synthetic blood he clearly despised, saying nothing, radiating the particular curiosity of a man studying something he didn't fully understand yet. Within a week, he'd started asking questions about the documents she uncovered. Within 2, he was reading beside her, quiet company that felt less like surveillance and more like something neither of them had a name for. The sleeping had gotten better too. Not perfect, not every night, but considerably more than the nothing he'd survived on for a decade. On the nights Marisol stayed in his chambers, curled beneath the same furs in her ever-rotating collection of flannel and novelty pajamas, Damien slept for hours at a stretch, sometimes entire nights, waking calm instead of coiled tight with the hyper-vigilant tension that had defined him for longer than he could accurately remember. Renata Voss noticed the change first, and noticed it with visible reluctance. The housekeeper had spent 3 weeks treating Marisol with barely concealed disdain, correcting her posture, criticizing her wardrobe, sighing audibly whenever donut boxes appeared in the kitchen. But she'd also watched her employer sleep through an entire night for the first time since Renata had started working at the estate, watched the permanent shadows beneath his eyes finally begin to fade, watched him laugh, actually laugh, at something Marisol said over dinner one evening. "You're doing something to him." Renata found Marisol elbow-deep in a box of 18th century correspondence one afternoon. "I don't know what it is. I don't entirely trust it. But I haven't seen him this steady in years. I'm not doing anything." Marisol didn't look up from the letter she was slowly unfolding. "I'm just sleeping." Renata studied her a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp, assessing eyes. "That may be the most dangerous thing anyone's ever done in this house." What Marisol didn't know, and what Renata understood far better than she let on, was exactly how much Victor Castellano had been counting on Damien's instability. For 18 months, Victor had been quietly building a case with the family's ruling council, presenting Damien's decade of sleeplessness and hypervigilance as evidence of a man unfit to continue leading, a man whose condition made him unpredictable, dangerous, a liability the organization couldn't afford to keep at its head. Every sleepless night had been ammunition. Every flash of temper born from exhaustion had been evidence. Victor had spent 18 months methodically assembling the exact argument that would finally hand him control, patient in the way only someone confident of eventual victory could afford to be. Marisol Vance had unraveled all of it in 3 weeks. Damien was sleeping. Damien was steady. Damien was, for the first time in a decade, exactly the kind of composed, rational leader the council had always claimed to want. And every night that continued was another night Victor's meticulously constructed case grew weaker. Victor understood this faster than anyone else at the estate. He'd tried the direct approach first, storming into Damien's chambers, attempting to remove Marisol by force, before Damien had thrown him through a stone wall for the effort. That door had closed. What remained was slower, quieter, considerably more dangerous for exactly that reason. It started small. A staff member Marisol had grown friendly with suddenly avoided her in the hallways, offering no explanation beyond a tight, uncomfortable smile. Another mentioned, almost in passing, that some of the older council members had concerns about a mortal living so freely within estate walls, concerns that had apparently reached certain ears and required watching. Then her research notes started disappearing, small things at first. A folder of transcribed letters she'd left on the reading table, gone the next morning without explanation. A box of catalogued index cards, reorganized in a way that made no archival sense. Hours of meticulous work undone overnight by someone who clearly understood exactly how to make the sabotage look like her own mistake, instead of deliberate interference. Marisol mentioned it to Damien once, casually, assuming exhaustion or her own disorganization. He didn't dismiss it the way she expected. "Show me exactly what's missing." His expression sharpened into something she recognized now as the calculation that lived beneath his usual composure. "Everything," Don't leave anything out, even if it seems insignificant. She walked him through 3 separate incidents over the past week, watching his jaw tighten with each one, watching the particular stillness that meant he was cataloging threats the same way she cataloged documents, methodically, patiently, building toward a conclusion he clearly didn't like arriving at. Someone inside this house is testing how far they can push before I notice. I want extra security on the library. Effective tonight. You think it's Victor. I think Victor doesn't need to touch you himself when he has staff willing to do smaller damage for him instead. Damien's eyes had gone hard, protective in a way that still surprised Marisol every time she witnessed it directly. He's patient. He's always been patient. That's what makes him dangerous. The extra security arrived within the hour. Quiet men positioned at the library entrance who said little and watched everything. Marisol returned to her work feeling steadier, though something in her chest still hummed with unease she couldn't quite shake. A sense that whatever Victor was building toward, this wasn't the end of it. 3 nights later, working alone in the library well past midnight because sleep had refused to come easily, Marisol reached for a box of correspondence she'd already catalogued and sorted the previous week, intending to double-check her citations before finalizing the entries. The box wasn't where she'd left it. She found it 3 shelves over, out of order, out of place, in a way that made her stomach drop before she'd even opened it. Inside, nestled among the 18th century letters she'd spent days meticulously preserving, sat something that didn't belong there at all. Her missing hairbrush. The one she'd assumed she'd simply misplaced during the move into her new quarters 2 weeks earlier. Beneath it, folded into quarters, sat a single sheet of paper. Not archival paper, modern, cheap, the kind torn from any notepad in the house. Marisol unfolded it with hands that had suddenly gone cold, understanding somewhere in her chest before her eyes fully processed the words scrawled across the page in handwriting she didn't recognize. Leave before he loses everything because of you. Marisol stood frozen in the silent library, the missing hairbrush clutched in one hand, the note in the other, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that whoever had written this had been inside her private quarters, had taken something personal, specifically to prove exactly how easily they could reach her, and had left it here, in her own catalogued archive, as a message calculated precisely enough to make sure she found it completely alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a way it hadn't since that very first night, before she fully understood that Damien wasn't actually the danger this house held. She thought about the missing folders, the reorganized index cards, small acts of sabotage she'd previously dismissed as accidents or exhaustion, and understood now they'd never actually been accidents at all. Someone had been building steadily toward exactly this moment for weeks now, testing her, testing how far they could push before she finally noticed, escalating slowly enough that each individual incident felt too small on its own to report, until this one arrived and made the entire pattern completely undeniable. She thought about calling for the security detail stationed just outside the entrance, about screaming loud enough for the entire wing to hear her, but something colder and more calculating settled over her instead. The same instinct that had once let her sign a contract nobody expected her to survive without a single tremor in her hand. Whoever had left this note wanted her frightened enough to run, wanted her gone before Damien fully understood what leaving would cost him, before the council could see exactly how much steadier he'd become in the 3 weeks since she'd walked through those iron gates. Marisol folded the note back into quarters, tucked it and the hairbrush into her jacket pocket, and walked slowly toward the library entrance with steps that didn't shake at all, understanding with sudden clarity that this note wasn't the end of anything. It was the opening move in whatever Victor Castellano intended to do next, and she had absolutely no intention of running from any of it. But standing alone in that silent library at nearly 1 in the morning, the note trembling slightly in her grip despite her outwardly steady breathing, Marisol understood one thing with complete certainty. Whoever had written those words hadn't acted alone, and whoever else was involved was still out there somewhere in this house right now, close enough to watch, close enough to wait patiently, and see exactly what she decided to do next. Marisol found Damien in his study an hour before dawn, the note and hairbrush laid flat on his desk between them without a single word of preamble needed. She'd debated waking him at all, weighing whether the discovery could wait until evening, until he'd had proper rest, until she'd calmed the tremor still lingering in her own hands. In the end, she'd decided some things couldn't wait, not when someone inside these walls had already proven exactly how far they were willing to go. He read it twice. His expression didn't change, though something behind his amber eyes went colder than she'd ever seen it. A stillness that felt less like calm now and more like the moment before a verdict. Who else knew about the hairbrush exactly? Nobody. Marisol crossed her arms, refusing to let her voice shake. That's what scares me. Whoever took it had to know my quarters well enough to find something that small. Damien picked up the note, studying the handwriting with the same precision he applied to every threat that had ever crossed his path. This isn't Victor's hand, but it's someone acting on his behalf, someone with access to staff quarters, and enough motive to risk direct sabotage, instead of waiting for the council's slower process. He stood abruptly, crossing to the window, jaw tight with a fury he was clearly working to keep leashed. I want every staff member's movements pulled from the last 3 weeks. Cross-reference against who had access to your quarters, who's had unsupervised time in the library, who's shown any recent contact with Victor outside official business. That could be dozens of people. Then, we narrow it down to one. Tonight, by midnight, Renata had assembled exactly what he needed. Security logs cross-referenced against staff schedules with a thoroughness that surprised even Marisol. One name surfaced within hours, a young footman named Elias, who'd started at the estate 8 months earlier, whose access badge had logged 3 separate late-night entries into the staff residential wing during weeks when Marisol's belongings had gone missing. Elias confessed within minutes of Damien entering the room, the particular fear of a young man who'd clearly understood the moment he saw Damien's face exactly how badly he'd miscalculated his own safety. Victor paid me. Elias's voice shook badly. Said it wasn't dangerous. Said I just needed to make her uncomfortable enough to leave on her own, that nobody would actually get hurt, that Victor just needed the council to see you unstable again before the vote. What vote? Damien asked quietly, voice gone entirely flat. Elias's face drained further. There's a formal vote scheduled in 3 days. Victor's been building support for months, convincing enough council members that your condition makes you unfit to lead. He needed something to happen before the vote, something to prove you'd lost control again. Damien's hand closed into a fist against the desk, though his voice stayed level, in a way that frightened Marisol more than shouting ever could have. 3 days. By morning, Marisol stood beside Damien as he addressed the full council for the first time in months, calm, lucid, steady, in a way none of the assembled elders had witnessed from him in over a decade. He laid out everything: Victor's months of manipulation, the sabotage campaign against Marisol, Elias's full confession recorded and verified by 3 separate witnesses. The council's reaction shifted visibly as Damien spoke, doubt curdling into something closer to disgust, as the full shape of Victor's campaign became impossible to ignore. Here was a man they'd been told was unstable, presenting evidence with more composure and clarity than Victor had ever managed in 18 months of quiet campaigning against him. Victor's own testimony collapsed within minutes of questioning, contradictions piling on contradictions, until even his most sympathetic allies on the council could no longer defend him without risking their own standing. The vote never happened. Instead, the council moved to strip Victor of his position entirely, exiling him from the family's territory permanently, with a warning that any attempt to return would be met with far less mercy than he'd just been shown by an assembly that no longer had any patience left for his ambitions. Victor left the estate that same evening, escorted by security to the front gates, his face carrying none of the arrogance he'd walked in with weeks earlier, when he'd first sneered at Marisol from across her hospital bed. Renata watched him go from the window of the kitchen, arms crossed, expression unreadable except for the small, satisfied set of her jaw. She'd spent 18 months quietly worried about exactly this outcome, watching Victor's campaign build momentum year after year, while Damien's condition made him harder and harder to defend to a council that valued composure above almost everything else. Watching that campaign finally collapse under the weight of its own cruelty felt, she admitted to herself, far more satisfying than she'd expected. She found Marisol in the library that same night, still shaken but steady, and set down a fresh pot of tea without a word of the usual criticism that had once defined every interaction between them. "I owe you an apology." Renata's voice stayed low. "I judged you the moment you walked through those doors. I was wrong. You were protecting him the entire time." Marisol's answer came without hesitation. "I understand that better than you think." Renata studied her a long moment, something warmer than Marisol had ever seen from her crossing her sharp, familiar features. "Take care of him. He deserves it, whatever the council or Victor or anyone else ever believed about him." 3 days after the council's ruling, Marisol found Damien on the same balcony where he'd first told her about the frenzy, the same story that had started everything between them, though the man standing there now looked nothing like the exhausted, hollow figure she'd first offered to help. "You're sleeping better." Marisol joined him at the railing. Every night this week, his voice carried something unguarded she'd rarely heard from him. "First time in over a decade I've slept through 7 consecutive nights." Marisol studied him. 3 weeks of danger and quiet devotion settling into something she could finally name clearly. "I keep thinking about that contract. $1 million to survive one night. I never once imagined it would turn into this." "Neither did I." Damien's answer came steady. "I've spent 300 years believing I understood exactly what I needed to survive. Feeding, restraint, distance from anything that might complicate the balance I'd built. Then a woman fell asleep in my bed within 3 minutes and unraveled every assumption I'd ever made about my own existence." That's not exactly a declaration. Something in her chest tightened at the raw honesty underneath his words. Damien turned to face her fully, close enough now that neither of them pretended the distance between them meant anything anymore. "I'm not offering you another contract. I'm not asking you to stay because you quiet the noise in my head, though you do. I'm asking because somewhere in the last month, I stopped thinking of you as the archivist keeping my library organized, and started thinking of you as the only person whose presence I actually want beside me, contract or not." Marisol's throat tightened, the fear that had defined the last month finally settling into something steadier than she'd felt in years. "I've spent 5 years surviving." Her voice stayed quiet. "Debt, exhaustion, my father dying slowly while I worked myself into the ground, trying to keep us both afloat. I signed that contract because it felt like the first real choice I'd had in years, even if it looked like a death sentence to everyone else. And now I'm choosing something else entirely. Not because you saved my life, or because Victor's gone, or because the money already changed everything about my mother's situation. Because somewhere in this house, wearing flannel pajamas in a vampire's bed, I found something I didn't know I was looking for." Damien's hand found hers on the railing, steady, certain, nothing performed about it anymore. "Stay." His voice dropped low. "Not as an employee, not as a tether for my condition. Stay because you want to be here, the same way I want you here, without a contract deciding either of our choices for us." Marisol closed the distance between them herself this time, the same way she'd once climbed into a stranger's bed without fear, choosing exactly what she wanted, without waiting for permission to want it. "Yes, I'm staying." The kiss that followed carried none of the quiet distance that had defined the beginning of whatever this had become. No negotiation, no contract, only 2 people who'd found something neither of them expected inside a room, built for something else entirely. 6 months later, Marisol stood in the fully catalogued library of Croft Manor, 3 centuries of chaotic history finally organized into something coherent and complete. Damien beside her, reviewing a first edition she'd uncovered that morning, calm and present, in a way that had become simply ordinary now instead of remarkable, a permanent part of both their lives. She thought about the diner booth, the fixer's warning, the whispers that said, No woman lasted a night with him. She thought about penguin pajamas, and a shattered composure, and a fury that had once cracked ancient stone to protect her from a threat she'd barely understood at the time. Some contracts end exactly where they began. Others, if you're fortunate enough to fall asleep in the right stranger's bed, become the beginning of something no amount of money could have ever purchased on its own, no matter how many zeros sat on the page. This story hit different, and if you felt it too, don't just scroll past. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments what you'd do if $1 million contract turned into the safest place you'd ever slept, because our next story is already waiting, and trust us, it's going to steal your heart just as fast as this one did, if not faster.